Welcome to Q&A practice. Let's start with the defense attorney. Ready? Here we go. Training that ordinary people, citizens who get up here usually don't know, to turn and look at the jury and answer questions and stuff like that. That's right, unless they are coached to do so by somebody, right? Objection to the term coached to do so, sustained. Ask that it be stricken. Court will order that it be stricken from the document. Your current title is Senior Forensic Scientist, is that right? Yes. Okay, and you do a lot of DNA testing? Yes. The unit you're attached to is a serology unit. That's a historical name. Yes. Okay, serology meaning a broader range of bodily fluid testings, right? Right. Include blood and saliva? Yes. And in the old days, before DNA, that's where people would do ADO typing of blood and that sort of thing. That's right. That's not done so much anymore in your lab. That's also true. All right, but it does include some training to be able to use these presumptive tests for blood. Yes, like phenolphthalein, right? Yes, or luminol. Yes, and actually luminol is not what you would consider a presumptive test for blood. It's an aid in identifying the location of blood. Okay, but it also identifies so many other agents that it's not specific to blood. That's right. It's really just something to help you visualize some areas so that you can later go and do the real presumptive tests for blood. That's right. Okay, now in your training and your experience with evidence collection, would you agree that it's important that if you are collecting evidence at the scene, that you have an objective, disinterested status with regard to that crime scene? Yeah, as a scientist, that's typically the way we like to think of ourselves. Sure, so you wouldn't want somebody who has got some personal involvement with the suspect even to be going to the suspect's house. That could taint whatever objectivity you might otherwise have when you collect evidence. Is that right? Objection, speculation, and relevance. I'm going to sustain the objection. Let me ask it this way. As part of your training and your experience with the crime lab collecting evidence, are there any kind of rules that say only disinterested parties should collect evidence at a scene? I think there are. I don't know if there are formal rules, but there are sort of informal rules. I have not ever had it come up with in regards to a scene, but cases that are submitted to the lab. If an analyst happens to know the suspect or the victim or even their relatives, they will excuse themselves and ask not to be involved in that case. Sure, and that's just common practice, custom and practice in your lab, right? Yes. And with regard to collection of scene material, biological type material that may have DNA in them, there's a very specialized, well, I shouldn't say that, but there is a specialized training to go through that people go through in order to collect that kind of evidence. Yes, there is. DNA evidence, although it's very helpful to scientists, it also has the drawback that it's very sensitive and potentially contamination can affect the results, right? I believe that's a possibility. Okay, and for instance, you know how DNA processing works, but one of the things that's so good about DNA is that you can get profiles from very tiny little amounts of DNA that may be left at a scene, right? That's true. And the way that's done is you take what otherwise would be a very tiny amount, and then it's amplified, it's multiplied through this process in the lab to the point where it's testable, right? That's true. And so when it's in that very small stage or status, if it's contaminated in some way, then the contaminant is multiplied along with it, right? Yes, it is. So that has a great potential then to give you unreliable results. If that would happen, I would agree. And should that happen, should some evidence come to your lab that's been contaminated at the scene, you might not know that when you do the test, right? That's right. And so have you heard of a phrase, garbage in, garbage out, from a science perspective in regards to computers usually? Okay, I guess. But in your field, that would also apply to whatever is brought to your lab for DNA testing. If it's contaminated at the beginning, the results would also be contaminated, or I should say unreliable. Yes, nothing that we do at the lab is going to decontaminate it. All right, thank you. And in fact, in your lab then, there is another risk. Items may be contaminated at the scene when they are collected, if they are not collected properly, right? They may be contaminated at some point from that from the scene until they reach your lab, possibly. And then there is also the risk of contamination of an item once it gets to your lab, right? That's also possible. In fact, during the test process, contamination may occur in your lab, yes. And in fact, does occur in your lab, yes. Any lab, yes. All crime labs have that risk and reality that test materials do sometimes become contaminated, right? That's right. And in fact, that's something that's of such concern to your lab that you keep a record of such contamination incident whenever it's discovered. Yes. What's that called? Contamination log. Okay, and that relates to incidents where the contamination has been able to be discovered by the scientist who's working on it, right? That's right. If some contamination occurs in your lab, though, and it's not discovered by the analyst, there is no record of that, right? There's no knowledge and no record, right? All right, now, sir, you mentioned that you were on November 4th or 5th. I'm going to direct your attention to that. The first day you said your answering service got a call. Did you actually speak directly yourself with Detective Riker? Yes, I called him back. Okay, and he gave you what information at that point? Objection, hearsay, not for the truth of the matter, simply to establish what his perspective was. I think before I can rule on the objection, I have to hear the answer to know the nature for which it's being offered. He told me his name, what agency he was with, that he was working in conjunction with another agency and with the state agency, and that he was requesting our assistance with regard to a missing persons case, and he told me the location of the place, and he told me who owned the property. And then you said by the time you arrived, it was about 4. I believe so. Are you sure of that? I'm not real good at keeping track of time in my head, and you now have my notes on times I will give those back to you, sir, at the scene. I'm sorry. I will make notations as I do things throughout the day, and I will note the time. Sure, take your time and refresh your recollection, if you will, please. Yes, arrived at the scene at 4 p.m. All right, and the first place you went, though, was to the command post. I think you described it as a fire truck with a canopy over it. Yeah, and was that down at sort of the entrance to this salvage yard area where there were some business buildings and that sort of thing? It was just before that. Before you even got to that, you said? Yes, right down along Adams Road. I would say where Adams Road first forked. Okay, and you spoke with Mr. Davis and Mr. Franks, right? Yes. Was anybody else briefing you at that point? Not really briefing me, but when we first arrived, you go through a checkpoint, tell them who you are, who's in the vehicle with you, and they record that, and then you are directed to go down the road to where you see the fire truck. And then someone met us there. I don't know who. I told them who I was with, who I was looking for at that point, Detective Riker. And then I was directed to under the canopy next to the fire truck. I was introduced to Investigator Davis and Tom Franks at that point, but there were many other people present. Sure. And then did you go down from that point directly to where the pilot had been located? Yes. So how long would you say you spend? How long would it take from when you got there at 4 until you got to the spot where the pilot was? 15 minutes maybe? 15 minutes to a half an hour. Okay, and when you got there, the pilot was no longer covered with a tarp. That's right. Counsel, would you please put up that photo? I have been unplugged. We're still not set up right. Can you use the Elmo? No, I would like to use this, please. You are sure, though, that the vehicle was not covered with a tarp when you first arrived? They were in the process of moving the tarp. The tarp was present. I was told that some of the branches that were now lying on the ground had been on top of the vehicle but fell off when they had pulled the tarp. Okay, but I don't believe I was present for the unveiling. You don't recall ever seeing the vehicle completely enclosed, covered with this tinted tarp thing? No, I don't. All right. Members of the jury, at this time, I should let you know that the technical problems we have been experiencing are not the result of any actions by either party to this action, and I'm told that hopefully over the noon hour they are going to be addressed and things will be cleaned up. we hope. I believe exhibit 144. I don't know if you have it marked yet. 80 or 81 would do fine. All right, we'll come back to this in a minute. He's going to have to reboot the thing and get us in a position where you can look at this photo. So I will move on. We'll come back right back to that in a few minutes. You, I believe, said that you took some photos that we saw, right? One of the first things you did was take pictures, yes, and looked at the debris and things that were piled up against it to see if there might be any biological evidence you could collect, yes. And did you move that debris at that point? Yes. So you actually moved the Dodge hood away completely? Yes. All right, we will stop there. That will conclude our Q&A practice.